The studio was filled with the rich perfume of roses, and the light summer wind brought the heavy scent of lilac from the garden through the open door. Lord Henry Wotton was lying on a divan, smoking one of his innumerable cigarettes. Beyond the soft buzzing of the bees in the garden, the distant noise of London could be heard. In the centre of the room, on an artist's easel, stood a portrait of an extraordinarily beautiful young man. Basil Hallwood, the artist, was sitting in front of it, smiling at his work of art.
"It is your best work, Basil. The best thing you've ever done,"
said Lord Henry languidly.
"You must send it to the Grosvenor. The Grosvenor is the only place to exhibit it."
"I don't think I shall send it anywhere,"
he answered. Lord Henry looked at him through the thin blue smoke of his cigarette.
"Not send it anywhere? My dear man, why not? What odd people you painters are. You do anything in the world to become famous, and when you're famous you're not happy."
"I know you'll laugh at me,"
Basil replied,
"but I really can't exhibit it. I've put too much of myself into it."
Lord Henry laughed.
"Too much of yourself into it? Basil, I didn't know you were so vain. You have black hair and a strong face. This young Adonis has delicate features, fair hair, and looks as if he were made of ivory and rose leaves. And well, you have an intellectual expression. And beauty ends where an intellectual expression begins. You don't look like your mysterious young friend at all. By the way, you haven't told me his name."
"You don't understand me, Harry,"
answered the artist.
"Of course I don't look like him. Dorian Gray is beautiful, and we all must pay for the gift the gods have given us, whether it is beauty or intellect. It's better not to be different from others. The ugly and the stupid have the best of it in this world."
"Dorian Gray? Is that his name?"
asked Lord Henry.
"Yes, but I didn't want to tell you."
"Why not?"
"Oh, I can't explain. When I like people immensely, I never tell their names to anyone. It's like losing a part of them. I love having secrets."
"You seem to forget that I'm married, and in marriage secrets are absolutely necessary. I never know where my wife is, and my wife never knows where I am. When we meet, which we occasionally do, we tell each other the most absurd stories with the most serious faces."
"I hate the way you talk about your married life, Harry,"
said Basil.
"I think you're a very good husband, but you're ashamed of your virtues. Your cynicism is simply a pose."
Lord Henry laughed, and the two men went out into the garden. After a while, Lord Henry pulled out his watch.
"I must go now, Basil, but before I go I want to know the real reason why you don't want to exhibit Dorian Gray's picture."
"Harry,"
said Basil,
"every portrait that is painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not of the sitter. I will not exhibit this picture because I'm afraid it shows the secret of my heart."
Lord Henry laughed.
"And what is that?"
"I'm afraid you'll hardly understand it."
Lord Henry picked a pink daisy from the grass and said,
"I can believe anything if it's incredible."
"The story is simply this,"
said the painter.
2 months ago, I went to a party at Lady Brandon's. After I'd been in the room about 10 minutes, I suddenly felt that someone was looking at me. I turned around and saw Dorian Gray for the first time. When our eyes met, I grew pale with terror. I knew I'd met someone whose personality could absorb my soul and my art. I had a strange feeling that fate had prepared exquisite joys and sorrows. I was afraid and wanted to leave the room. Lady Brandon stopped me, and suddenly I found myself face to face with this young man. We were quite close, and our eyes met. I asked Lady Brandon to introduce me to him.
"Tell me more about Dorian Gray,"
Lord Henry said.
"How often do you see him?"
"Every day. I couldn't be happy if I didn't see him every day. He's absolutely necessary to me."
"How extraordinary! I thought you'd never care for anything but your art."
He's all my art to me now,
said the painter.
He's my inspiration. Since I met Dorian, I've created the best work of my life. He knows nothing of my adoration for him, but if people saw this portrait, they might guess the secret of my heart, Harry.
Tell me, Basil, does Dorian Gray like you?
Asked Lord Henry.
I know he likes me. As a rule, he's charming to me, but sometimes he seems to enjoy hurting me. Then I feel I've given my heart to someone who thinks it's simply a lovely flower to enjoy on a summer day.
Summer days, Basil, can sometimes linger,
murmured Lord Henry.
Perhaps you'll become tired sooner than he will.
Harry, don't say that. As long as I live, the personality of Dorian Gray will dominate me.
Lord Henry was amused. How delightful other people's emotions were.
I'd like to meet him.
I don't want you to meet him.
Mr. Dorian Gray is in the studio, sir, said the butler, coming into the garden.
You must introduce me now,
cried Lord Henry, laughing. The painter said to his servant,
Ask Mr. Gray to wait, Parker.
Then he looked at Lord Henry.
Dorian Gray is my dearest friend. He's a simple, beautiful person. Don't spoil him. Don't try to influence him. Your influence would be bad. Don't take away from me the person who makes me a true artist.
What nonsense,
said Lord Henry, smiling. Chapter 2. The Picture. As they entered the house, they saw Dorian Gray. He was seated at the piano with his back to them, turning over the pages of some music by Schumann.
You must lend me these, Basil,
he cried.
That depends on how you sit today, Dorian.
Oh, I'm tired of sitting, and I don't want a portrait of myself,
answered the boy, turning round. When he saw Lord Henry, a faint blush coloured his cheeks.
Oh, I beg your pardon, Basil. I didn't know there was anyone with you.
This is Lord Henry Wotton, an old friend of mine,
said Basil.
I'm very pleased to meet you,
said Lord Henry, looking at him. Yes, he was wonderfully handsome, with his scarlet lips, honest blue eyes and golden hair. His face had the purity and candour of youth that inspired trust. No wonder Basil Hallward worshipped him. The painter was busy mixing his colours and getting his brushes ready. Then he turned to Lord Henry and said,
Harry, I want to finish this picture today. Would you think it very rude of me if I asked you to go away?
Lord Henry smiled and looked at Dorian Gray.
Should I go, Mr. Gray?
Oh, please don't, Lord Henry. Basil is in one of his difficult moods, and I hate it when he's difficult. Basil, please ask Lord Henry to stay. I insist.
Hallward bit his lip.
If Dorian wishes it, you must stay. And now, Dorian, take your place and don't move about or pay attention to what Lord Henry says. He has a very bad influence on all his friends, except myself.
While Basil was painting, Lord Henry talked and talked. And he had such a beautiful musical voice. His fascinating words touched a secret chord in Dorian that had never been touched before. Only music had had this effect on him.
I believe that the aim of life is self-development, to realize one's nature perfectly. Every impulse we try to kill stays in our mind and poisons us. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to give in to it.
Dorian began to understand things about himself that he had never understood before. Words! How terrible they were! How clear and vivid and cruel! Lord Henry watched Dorian with his subtle smile. He knew when to speak and when to be silent. He was surprised at the sudden effect of his words on this fascinating boy.
Basil, I'm tired of standing,
cried Dorian Gray suddenly.
I must go and sit in the garden.
My dear fellow, I'm so sorry. When I paint, I only think of my work. I don't know what Harry has been saying to you, but you have a wonderful expression on your face.
Lord Henry and Dorian went out into the garden, while Basil worked on the portrait. Dorian buried his face in the lilac blossoms and enjoyed their heavy perfume. Lord Henry murmured,
"You're right to do that. Nothing can cure the soul but the senses, just as nothing can cure the senses but the soul."
Dorian Gray turned his head away. He liked the tall, graceful young man who was standing by him, but for some reason he felt afraid of him.
"Let's go and sit in the shade,"
said Lord Henry.
"You mustn't let the sun burn your face."
What does it matter?
cried Dorian Gray, laughing.
"It should matter very much to you, Mr. Gray.
Why?
Because you're young, and youth is the one thing that really matters."
I don't feel that, Lord Henry.
"No, you don't feel it now. Some day, when you're old and ugly, you'll feel it terribly. You have a wonderfully beautiful face, Mr. Gray. Beauty is a form of genius. It's one of the great facts of the world, like sunlight or springtime. But your beauty won't last forever. When your youth goes, your beauty will go with it. Live the wonderful life that is in you. Be afraid of nothing. We degenerate into hideous puppets, tormented by the passions and temptations we were afraid to give in to. There is absolutely nothing in the world but youth."
Dorian Gray listened wide-eyed without speaking. He was experiencing a new emotion he could not express. Suddenly, the painter appeared at the door of the studio.
Dorian, come in.
They walked towards the house together.
"You're glad you have met me, Mr. Gray,"
said Lord Henry.
Yes, I'm glad now. I wonder if I'll always be glad.
"Always? That is a terrible word. Women are so fond of using it,"
said Lord Henry. After about a quarter of an hour, Basil stopped painting. He stood back and looked at Dorian and the painting.
It's finished,
he cried, and signed his name in red letters on the bottom of the canvas. Lord Henry examined the picture. It certainly was a wonderful work of art.
"My dear fellow, this is the finest portrait of our times. Mr. Gray, come over and look at yourself."
Dorian looked at the picture, and for a moment his cheeks flushed with pleasure. The sense of his own beauty came to him like a revelation. Then he remembered Lord Henry's words about the brevity of youth and beauty. Yes, he would become wrinkled and old, and all the grace would disappear from his figure. He would become ugly. The thought froze his heart.
Don't you like it?
Cried Hallward.
"Of course he likes it,"
said Lord Henry.
"It's one of the greatest things in modern art. I'll pay any sum for it. I must have it."
It is not my property, Harry.
"Whose property is it?"
Dorian's, of course,
answered the painter.
"He's a very lucky fellow."
How sad it is,
murmured Dorian Gray, still staring at his portrait.
I'll grow old and horrible, but this picture will always remain young. If it were only the other way. I wish I could stay young and the picture grow old. I'd give everything for that. I'd give my soul for that.
Lord Henry laughed.
"I don't think you'd like it, Basil."
No, I wouldn't,
agreed Basil.
Of course, you like your art better than your friends. How long will you like me? Only while I'm beautiful, I suppose. I'm jealous of the portrait, Basil. Its beauty will never die. Lord Henry is perfectly right. Youth is the most important thing in the world. I'll kill myself when I find that I'm growing old.
Don't talk like that, Dorian,
said Basil in amazement.
You're my dearest friend.
Basil turned to Lord Henry and asked angrily,
What have you been teaching him? Why didn't you go away when I asked you?
Lord Henry shrugged his shoulders.
It's the real Dorian Gray, that's all.
It isn't. Harry, I can't argue with my two best friends at the same time. Between you both, you have made me hate my best work. I'll destroy it now, before it destroys our friendship.
He picked up a palette knife. Dorian ran towards the painter and stopped his hand.
Don't, Basil! It would be murder!
I'm glad you appreciate my work at last, Dorian,
said the painter coldly.
Appreciate it? I'm in love with it. It's a part of myself.
Later, while they were having tea, Lord Henry suggested going to the theatre.
I'd like to come to the theatre with you, Lord Henry,
said Dorian.
Then you will come, and you will come too, Basil.
I can't. I have a lot of work to do.
Well, then, you and I will go alone, Mr. Gray.
The painter bit his lip and walked to the painting.
I shall stay with the real Dorian,
he said sadly. When the two men had closed the door behind them, Basil flung himself on the sofa, and a look of pain came into his face. Chapter 4. The Prison of Love.
Mother, I'm so happy,
whispered the girl, resting her head on her mother's lap. The tired-looking woman was sitting in the only armchair of their dingy sitting room.
I'm so happy.
Sybil repeated.
And you must be happy too.
Mrs. Vane put her thin white hands on her daughter's head.
I'm only happy when I see you act. You must think only about acting. We're poor. We need money. What do you know about this young man? You don't even know his name.
His name doesn't matter. I call him Prince Charming, and he's everything to me. I love him because he is what love should be, and he loves me.
You're too young to think of love,
said her mother. She looked at her daughter's radiant face and tried to warn her of the dangers of love, but the girl was locked in the prison of love and would not listen. At that moment, the door opened and a young man with brown hair came into the room. His hands and feet were large and clumsy. Mrs. Vane smiled at him, and Sybil hugged him. James Vane looked into his sister's face with tenderness.
I want you to come out with me for a walk, Sybil. As you know, tonight I'm leaving for Australia, and I won't see you for a very long time.
Oh, Jim, you really want to take me out for a walk? Let's go to the park.
She ran upstairs to get dressed. When James and his mother were alone, he said,
I've heard that a gentleman comes to the theatre every night to talk to Sybil.
Yes, the young man is undoubtedly a gentleman, James. Probably a member of the aristocracy.
James bit his lip.
Watch over Sybil, Mother. I'll be in Australia, and you're the only one who can protect her.
At that moment, Sybil entered the room and said,
I'm ready, Jim. Let's go out.
In the park, Sybil talked excitedly to her brother, but he was sad and gloomy.
You're not listening to a word I'm saying, Jim,
cried Sybil.
Why are you so sad?
I've heard you have a new friend. Who is he? What do you know about him? Can you trust him?
Stop, Jim. You mustn't say anything against him. I love him.
But you don't even know his name,
answered James.
He's called Prince Charming. He's the most wonderful person in the world. I wish you could see him.
Sybil, tonight I'm leaving, and I'm worried about you. I want you to be careful. You're mad about him, but you don't know his intentions. If he ever hurts you, I'll kill him.
She looked at him in horror. He repeated his words, and they cut the air like a knife. The people around them gaped.
Come away, Jim. You don't know what you're saying. He loves me, and he'll love me forever. You're simply jealous. I wish you would fall in love. Love makes people good.
I hope you're right, Sybil.
They returned home, and James had a small meal. Soon it was time for him to leave. He kissed his sister tenderly, then turned to his mother and said,
Goodbye, Mother. Don't forget that you have only one child to look after now. If that man hurts her, I'll kill him like a dog. I swear it. I suppose you've heard the news, Basil?
said Lord Henry that evening, while they were having dinner at the Bristol Hotel.
No, Harry.
Answered Basil.
What is it?
Dorian Gray's engaged to be married,
said Lord Henry, watching him as he spoke. Basil frowned.
Dorian? Engaged to be married? Impossible.
It's perfectly true.
To whom?
To some little actress.
I can't believe it. Think of Dorian's position and wealth. It would be absurd for him to marry an actress. I hope the girl is good.
Oh, she's better than good. She's beautiful,
murmured Lord Henry.
And Dorian is not often wrong about these things. We'll see her tonight, so we'll judge for ourselves.
But Dorian can't marry an actress. It's absurd,
cried the painter, biting his lip.
Why?
Lord Henry said coolly.
He'll love her wildly for 6 months, and then suddenly he'll be in love with another woman. It will be amusing to watch.
You don't mean a word of that.
Lord Henry laughed.
Here's Dorian himself. He'll tell you more than I can.
My dear Harry, my dear Basil, you must both congratulate me,
said Dorian, shaking their hands.
I've never been so happy.
I hope you'll always be very happy, Dorian,
said Basil.
But why didn't you tell me? You told Harry.
There isn't really much to tell,
cried Dorian.
Last night I went to see her act. She's an artist. After the performance I went to speak to her. As we were sitting together, suddenly a look came into her eyes that I'd never seen before. My lips moved towards hers. We kissed each other. I can't describe what I felt at that moment.
At what point did you mention the word marriage, Dorian? And what did she say? Perhaps you forgot all about it,
asked Lord Henry.
I didn't make a formal proposal. I told her that I loved her. When I'm with her, I forget all your fascinating, terrible ideas, your theories about life, love, pleasure.
Pleasure is the only thing worth having ideas about. When we're happy, we're always good. But when we're good, we are not always happy.
I know what pleasure is,
cried Dorian.
It is to adore someone.
That's certainly better than being adored.
Harry, you're terrible. I don't know why I like you so much.
You'll always like me, Dorian. I represent all the sins you've never had the courage to commit.
What nonsense, Harry. Let's go to the theatre. When Sybil comes on stage, you'll have a new ideal in life.
The painter was silent and gloomy. He could not bear the idea of this marriage. He felt that Dorian would never be to him all that he had been in the past. Life had come between them. When he arrived at the theatre, he felt he had grown years older. Chapter 5. The Theatre. The theatre was crowded that night, and it was oppressively hot. Dorian, Lord Henry and Basil were sitting in a private box. Young people were shouting to each other across the theatre, eating oranges and drinking from bottles.
What a place to find one's love in,
said Lord Henry.
Yes, you're right, Harry,
answered Dorian.
The place is awful, but when she acts, you'll forget these common, rough people with their coarse faces and vulgar gestures. She has the power to elevate them.
I understand what you mean, Dorian, and I believe in this girl,
said the painter.
If she can give a soul to those who have lived without one, if she can create the sense of beauty in people whose lives have been ugly, she deserves all your adoration.
Thank you, Basil,
answered Dorian, pressing his hand. After a quarter of an hour, accompanied by extraordinary applause, Sybil Vane appeared on the stage. Yes, she was certainly lovely to look at. One of the loveliest women Lord Henry had ever seen. Basil jumped to his feet and applauded. Motionless, Dorian Gray stared at her dreamily. She moved across the stage like a goddess. Yet she was strangely lifeless. When she spoke, her words sounded artificial and meaningless. Her tone was false and unnatural. Her acting lacked passion and vitality. Dorian Gray grew pale as he watched her. His friend said nothing to him, but she seemed absolutely incompetent. They were horribly disappointed. She grew worse as she went on. Her gestures became artificial. She was a failure. The people in the theatre lost interest and started to talk loudly and laugh. Sybil did not seem to notice anything. At the end of the second act, Lord Henry got up and said,
"She's very beautiful, Dorian, but she can't act. Let's go."
I'm going to see the entire play,
answered Dorian in a bitter voice.
I'm so sorry that I've wasted your time.
My dear Dorian, perhaps Miss Vane is ill,
said Basil.
I wish she were ill, but she seems to be simply callous and cold. She's completely changed. Last night she was a great artist. This evening she's a mediocre actress. Go away. I want to be alone. Can't you see my heart is breaking?
Hot tears came to his eyes, and he hid his face in his hands. As soon as the play was over, he rushed to see Sybil. When she saw him, an expression of great joy came over her.
Dorian! How badly I acted tonight,
she cried.
Horribly! It was terrible. Are you ill? You have no idea how I suffered.
Dorian, don't you understand?
She said, smiling.
Understand what?
He asked angrily.
Why I was so bad tonight. Well, I'll always be a bad actress.
You're ill, I suppose. When you're ill, you shouldn't act. My friends were bored. I was bored.
She did not seem to listen to him.
Dorian,
she cried.
Before I knew you, acting was the only thing in my life. It was only in the theatre that I lived. Then you came and freed my soul from prison. You made me understand what love really is. It wasn't what I was playing on the stage. Only your love is real to me. Everything else is false and artificial. My love, take me away with you where we can be alone.
Dorian threw himself on the sofa and said coldly,
You've killed my love.
She looked at him in wonder and laughed.
Yes, you've killed my love,
he repeated.
I loved you because you were marvellous, because you had genius and intellect. You've thrown it all away. You're shallow and stupid. My God, how mad I was to love you. What a fool I've been. You're nothing to me now. I'll never see you again. Without your art, you're nothing.
The girl trembled.
You aren't serious, Dorian,
she murmured. She put her hand on his arm.
Don't touch me,
he cried. She threw herself at his feet and lay there like a trampled flower.
Dorian, don't leave me,
she whispered.
Can't you forgive me for tonight? I'll work so hard and try to improve. Don't be cruel to me because I love you better than anything in the world. Oh, don't leave me.
She crouched on the floor like a wounded thing, and Dorian, with his beautiful eyes, looked down at her in disdain. Her tears annoyed him.
I'm going,
he said, in his calm, clear voice.
I don't want to be unkind, but I can't see you again. You've disappointed me.
He turned around and in a few moments he was out of the theatre. He walked through dark streets and past dingy houses. At dawn he was near Covent Garden, from where he took a carriage home. As he passed through his library, his eye fell on his portrait. He stared at it in surprise and walked on into his bedroom. Then he returned to the library and examined the picture. In the dim light, the face appeared to be changed. The expression looked different. He walked to the window and opened the curtains. He looked at the portrait again. The bright sunlight showed him the lines of cruelty around the mouth. He picked up a small oval mirror, one of Lord Henry's many gifts, and looked at his real face. There were no hard lines around his mouth. He examined the picture again. His expression in the painting had changed. It was horribly apparent. He threw himself into a chair and began to think. Suddenly he remembered his words in Basil's studio the day the picture had been finished. He had made a mad wish that he might remain young and beautiful, and the painting should grow old and ugly, that the face in the picture might reflect his passions and sins, and that he might keep the candour of youth. Had his wish come true? Such things were impossible, and yet there was the picture in front of him, with a touch of cruelty in the mouth. Cruelty? Had he been cruel? No. Why should he think about Sybil Vane? She was nothing to him now. The picture held the secret of his life and told his story. It had taught him to love his own beauty. Would it teach him to hate his own soul? It was the mirror of his conscience. He decided to save himself, to resist temptation. He would not see Lord Henry again. He would not listen to his poisonous theories. He would go back to Sybil Vane, marry her, and try to love her again. His life with her would be beautiful and pure. He got up from his chair and put a large screen in front of the portrait.
How horrible,
he murmured to himself. Then he went out into the garden and thought only of Sybil. Chapter 6. The Death of Love. It was long past noon when he awoke. His servant came in softly with a cup of tea and some letters. He noticed that one was from Lord Henry and put it aside. After about 10 minutes he got up, had a cool bath, got dressed, and went into the library to have a light breakfast. It was an exquisite day. He felt perfectly happy. Suddenly his eye fell on the screen that he had put in front of the portrait, and he jumped. Was it all true? Had the portrait really changed? The thing was absurd. Should he move the screen? Why not let it stay there? But what if someone else looked at the portrait and it had really changed? What would he do if Basil came and asked to look at his own picture? He had to examine it at once. He locked both doors and then removed the screen. It was true. The portrait had changed. He shuddered with horror and felt afraid. The portrait had made him conscious of how cruel and unjust he had been to Sybil. He went to the table and wrote a passionate letter to her, begging her forgiveness and accusing himself of madness. When we blame ourselves, we feel that no one else can blame us. When Dorian had finished the letter, he felt that he had been forgiven. Suddenly there was a knock at the door, and Lord Henry's voice outside.
"My dear boy, I must see you."
Dorian put the screen in front of the picture and unlocked the door.
"I'm so sorry about it all, Dorian,"
said Lord Henry.
"but you mustn't think too much about her."
Do you mean Sybil Vane?
Dorian asked.
"Of course,"
answered Lord Henry, sitting down and slowly pulling off his gloves.
It's terrible, but it isn't your fault. Did you go and see her after the play was over?
Yes.
Did you have an argument?
It was brutal, Harry. Perfectly brutal. But it's all right now. I'm not sorry for anything that happened. It's taught me to know myself better.
Ah, Dorian, I'm so glad you see it that way.
My dear Harry, I know what a conscience is now. It's the most divine thing in us. I want to be good. I don't want to destroy my soul.
I admire your intentions, but how are you going to begin?
By marrying Sybil Vane.
Marrying Sybil Vane?
cried Lord Henry.
Dorian, didn't you get my letter?
Your letter? Oh, yes, but I haven't read it yet.
You know nothing, then.
What do you mean?
Lord Henry sat down by Dorian, took both his hands, and held them tightly.
Dorian, my letter was to tell you that Sybil Vane is dead.
Dead?
Cried Dorian, jumping to his feet.
Sybil? Dead? It's not true. It's a horrible lie.
It's true, Dorian,
said Lord Henry gravely.
It's in all the morning papers. There will be an inquest, and you must keep your name out of this scandal. Things like this make a man fashionable in Paris, but not in London.
Dorian was dazed with horror. Finally he said,
Oh, Harry, be quick. Tell me everything at once.
I'm certain it wasn't an accident, although it must be described that way officially. The girl swallowed some poison.
Harry, it's terrible. It's all my fault. I was terribly cruel to her. I've murdered Sybil Vane.
You didn't kill her, Dorian,
said Lord Henry.
She killed herself because you didn't love her anymore. It's never happened to me. If you'd married Sybil, you would have been very unhappy and your marriage would have been a failure. Don't waste your tears on Sybil Vane. She's played her last part. Come and dine with me, and later we'll go to the opera.
So I've murdered Sybil Vane. Yet the roses are not less lovely, and the birds sing just as happily. Why is it that I can't feel this tragedy as much as I want to? I don't think I'm heartless. Do you?
You've done too many foolish things in the last fortnight to be heartless, Dorian,
said Lord Henry, with his sweet, sad smile. There was silence. After some time, Dorian looked up.
You've explained me to myself, Harry. How well you know me. You're certainly my best friend. But we won't talk about this any more. It's been a marvellous experience. I think I shall join you at the opera tonight, Harry. I feel too tired to eat anything.
I'll see you before 9:30, I hope.
As soon as Lord Henry had left, Dorian moved to the screen and looked at the picture again. No, there was no further change. It had received the news of Sybil's death before he had known of it himself. Poor Sybil. She had died for love of him. He felt that the time had come for making his choice. Or had life already decided for him? Eternal youth, infinite passion, secret pleasures, wild joys, and wilder sins. He would have all these things. The portrait would carry all the shame. That was all. The portrait would be a magic mirror of his soul. An hour later, he was at the opera with Lord Henry. Chapter 7. The Confession. As Dorian was having breakfast the next morning, Basil Hallward came into the room.
I'm so glad I found you, Dorian,
he said.
I called last night, and they told me you were at the opera. Of course, I know that was impossible, but you didn't tell anyone where you were. I spent a terrible evening worrying about you. I can't tell you how heartbroken I am about the whole thing. I know what you must suffer. Did you go and see the girl's mother? What did she say about it all?
My dear Basil, I don't know.
said Dorian, drinking some wine and looking very bored.
I was at the opera.
You went to the opera?
Said Hallward, speaking very slowly.
You went to the opera while Sybil Vane was lying dead in some dirty room? Dorian, how could you?
Stop, Basil. I won't hear it,
cried Dorian.
What is done is done. What is past is past.
You call yesterday the past?
Only stupid people need years to lose an emotion. I don't want to be dominated by my emotions. I want to use them, to enjoy them, to dominate them.
Dorian, this is horrible. Something has changed you completely. You look exactly like the beautiful boy who came to my studio. But you were simple and affectionate then. You talk as if you had no heart, no pity. It's all Harry's influence. I can see that.
Harry has taught me many things, Basil. You've only taught me to love my own beauty.
I'm very sorry for that, Dorian.
I don't know what you mean, Basil. What do you want?
I want the Dorian Gray I used to paint,
said the artist sadly.
Basil, I was a boy when you met me. I'm a man now. I have new passions, new thoughts, new ideas. I'm different, but you must always be my friend. Of course, I'm very fond of Harry, but I know that you're better than he is. Don't leave me, Basil, and don't argue with me. I am what I am.
The painter was moved by Dorian's words. Dorian was very dear to him, and he did not want to argue with him. He hoped that his cold indifference was merely a passing mood.
Well, Dorian,
he said with a sad smile,
I won't speak to you again about this horrible thing. You must come and sit for me soon.
I can never sit for you again, Basil. It's impossible,
he cried.
What nonsense! Don't you like the portrait I did for you? Where is it? Why have you put a screen in front of it?
The light was too strong for the picture.
Too strong? No, the light is perfect here. Let me see it.
He walked towards the portrait. A cry of terror came from Dorian Gray's lips, and he rushed between the painter and the screen.
Basil!
He said.
If you try to look at it, I'll never speak to you again as long as I live.
Hallward was shocked. He had never seen Dorian like this before. He was pale and trembling with rage.
Of course I won't look at it if you don't want me to,
he said rather coldly.
But it seems absurd that I shouldn't see my own work, especially as I'm going to exhibit it in Paris in the autumn.
To exhibit it? You want to exhibit it?
Exclaimed Dorian Gray in terror. Was the world going to see his secret?
You told me a month ago that you would never exhibit it,
he cried.
Why have you changed your mind?
The painter looked troubled.
Let's sit down. Dorian, have you ever noticed anything strange in the picture?
Basil!
Cried Dorian, staring at him with wild eyes.
I see you did. Listen to what I have to say. From the moment I met you, your personality had the most extraordinary influence over me. I was totally dominated by you. I wanted to have you all to myself. I was only happy when I was with you. One day, a fatal day, I sometimes think, I decided to paint a portrait of you. When it was finished, I looked at it and felt that I'd put too much of myself into it. But after the painting had left my studio, its terrible fascination went with it. I felt I'd been foolish, and when I received this offer from Paris, I decided to accept. I never thought you'd refuse. However, I won't exhibit it if you don't want me to.
Dorian Gray took a long breath. The danger was over. Yet he felt pity for the painter who had just made this strange confession to him. He wondered if he would ever be dominated by the personality of a friend, like Lord Henry, perhaps.
It's extraordinary that you saw this in the portrait.
I saw something in it that seemed very strange,
said Dorian.
Well, you don't mind if I look at it now?
Dorian shook his head.
You mustn't ask me that, Basil.
Well, goodbye then,
said the painter sadly.
I understand how you feel.
As Hallward left the room, Dorian smiled to himself. Poor Basil! How little he knew the true reason. How strange it was. Instead of having to reveal his own secret, he had succeeded in learning his friend's secret. Now he understood the painter's wild devotion and jealousy, and he felt sorry. There was something tragic in a friendship so coloured by romance. He rang the bell, and his servant entered. He asked for him to send Mrs. Leaf, the housekeeper, to the library. When she arrived, he asked her for the key of the old schoolroom. The old woman gave him the key and left the room. Dorian put the key in his pocket and looked around. He saw a large purple bed cover embroidered in gold. He picked it up and covered the terrible thing. An hour later, 2 men arrived to move the portrait upstairs.
"I'm afraid it's rather heavy,"
said Dorian, opening the door of the schoolroom where he was going to hide the secrets of his corrupted soul. He had not entered the room since his cruel grandfather's death. Every moment of his lonely, painful childhood came back to him as he looked around. He remembered the immaculate purity of his life as a young boy, and now he was hiding the fatal portrait there. It was the only safe place in the house. He had the key, and no one else could enter to see his shame. On returning to the library, he found a note and a book that Lord Henry had sent him. Lord Henry's note said that he had sent him a book that might interest him. His eyes fell on the yellow book, and he began reading it. After a few minutes he became absorbed by the strange book about a young Parisian who spent his life searching for and enjoying all sorts of passions and pleasures, good and evil. Dorian Gray was fascinated by the book and could not put it down. When he finally met Lord Henry at the club, it was nearly 9 o'clock. Lord Henry was sitting alone and looking bored.
"It's all your fault, Harry,"
he cried.
"That book you sent me made me forget the time."
I thought you'd like it,
said Lord Henry.
"I didn't say I liked it. I said it fascinated me. There's a great difference."
Chapter 9. The Revelation. The 2 men began climbing the stairs. When they reached the top, Dorian unlocked the door.
"Do you insist on knowing, Basil?"
he asked in a low voice.
"Yes, I'm delighted."
He answered, smiling.
"You're the only man in the world who has a right to know everything about me. You've influenced my life more than you think."
Dorian opened the door, and Hallward looked around with a puzzled expression. The room was covered with dust, and there were holes in the carpet.
"So you think that only God sees the soul, Basil? Take the cover off the portrait and you'll see mine."
The voice that spoke was cold and cruel.
"You're mad, Dorian,"
said Hallward.
"You won't do it? Then I must do it myself,"
said the young man, pulling off the cover and throwing it on the floor.
Ugh!
An exclamation of horror came from the painter's lips as he saw the hideous face on the canvas grinning at him. There was something in its expression that filled him with disgust. Good heavens! It was Dorian Gray's own face that he was looking at. It still had some of that marvellous beauty under the horror that disfigured it. But who had done it? He held the lamp up to the picture. In the left-hand corner was his own name. It was his own picture, and in a moment his blood became as cold as ice. What had happened? He turned and looked at Dorian Gray with the eyes of a sick man.
What does this mean?
Cried Hallward in a strange voice.
"Years ago, when I was a boy,"
said Dorian Gray,
"you met me and taught me to love my own beauty. One day, I met a friend of yours who explained to me the wonder of youth, and you finished my portrait, which revealed to me the wonder of beauty. In a mad moment, I made a wish, or perhaps you'd call it a prayer."
I remember it. Oh, how well I remember it. No, it's impossible. There must have been something wrong with the paint. I tell you, the thing is impossible.
What is impossible?
Murmured the young man.
You told me you destroyed it.
I was wrong. It has destroyed me.
I don't believe it's my picture.
Can't you see your ideal in it?
Asked Dorian bitterly.
There was nothing evil in my ideal, nothing shameful. This is the face of a satyr.
It's the face of my soul.
What have I worshipped? It has the eyes of a devil.
Each of us has heaven and hell in him,
cried Dorian.
My God! If this is true, and that's what you've done with your life, you must be even worse than people say.
Hallward threw himself into an old chair and buried his face in his trembling hands. He could hear Dorian sobbing at the window.
Pray, Dorian, pray,
he murmured.
The prayer of your pride was answered. The prayer of your repentance will be answered too. I worshipped you too much. I'm punished for it. You worshipped yourself too much. We're both punished.
It's too late, Basil.
It's never too late. Let's pray together.
Prayers mean nothing to me now.
Don't say that. You've done enough evil in your life. Don't you see that repugnant thing staring at us?
Dorian looked at the picture, and suddenly an uncontrollable feeling of hatred for Basil Hallward came over him. He hated him more than he had ever hated anything in his life. He looked wildly around. His eyes fell on a knife lying on top of a cupboard. He seized the knife, rushed towards Hallward and stabbed him in the neck, behind the ear. Dorian stabbed him again and again. There was a groan, and then the horrible sound of someone suffocating. Hallward raised his arms 3 times. He stabbed him twice again, but the man did not move. Something began to trickle on the floor. It was Basil's blood. Dorian threw the knife on the table and listened. The man was sitting with his head on the table. He seemed to be asleep. How quickly it had been done. He felt strangely calm. He picked up the lamp and left the room without looking at the murdered man. He felt that the secret of the whole thing was not to think about it. The friend who had painted the fatal portrait had gone out of his life. That was enough. When he reached the library, he saw the bag and coat. He hid them in a secret cupboard where he kept his own disguises. He could easily get rid of them later. Then he pulled out his watch. It was 20 to 2. He sat down and began thinking. What evidence was there against him? Basil Hallward had left the house at 11. No one had seen him come in again. His servant had gone to bed. Paris? Yes. Basil had gone to Paris on the midnight train as he had intended. It would be months before anyone suspected anything. Everything could be destroyed long before then. He could get away with it. Suddenly he had a thought. He put on his coat and hat, opened the door and slipped out. Then he began ringing the bell. After 5 minutes his servant appeared, looking very drowsy.
I'm sorry to wake you up, Francis,
he said.
but I forgot my key. What time is it?
2:10, sir.
2:10? How horribly late. You must wake me up at 9 tomorrow. I have some work to do.
All right, sir.
Did anyone call this evening?
Mr. Hallward, sir. He stayed here until 11, and then he went to catch his train.
Oh, I'm sorry I didn't see him. Did he leave any message?
No, sir, except that he would write to you from Paris.
That is all, Francis.
Dorian went into the library, took the blue book from one of the shelves, and began turning the pages.
Alan Campbell, 152 Hertford Street, Mayfair.
Yes, that was the man he wanted. Chapter 10. Alan Campbell. At 9 o'clock the next morning, his servant came in and opened the curtains. Dorian was sleeping peacefully with one hand under his cheek. He looked like a boy. As he opened his eyes, a smile passed across his lips. Slowly, he remembered the events of the night before, and for a moment the same hatred for Basil Hallward came back to him. The dead man was still sitting upstairs, in the sunlight now. He felt that if he continued thinking about it, he would go mad. He got up quickly, got dressed with more than usual care, and had his breakfast. Then he went over to the table and wrote 2 letters. One he put in his pocket, the other he handed to his servant.
Take this to 152 Hertford Street, Francis, and if Mr. Campbell is out of town, get his address.
He was nervous. Every second he kept looking at the clock. He became horribly agitated. What if Alan Campbell was out of England? What if he refused to come? Alan Campbell was an extremely intelligent young man. Science was his passion, and he had a chemistry laboratory of his own. He was an excellent musician, too. They had met at Lady Berkshire's the night that Rubinstein played there. They had been inseparable for 18 months. Then, suddenly people had noticed that they scarcely spoke when they met. Campbell had become sad and uninterested in music. Nobody knew what had happened between the 2 men. This was the man Dorian was waiting for. The suspense became unbearable. At last the door opened, and his servant entered.
Mr. Campbell, sir.
Dorian breathed deeply. Alan Campbell walked in, looking very stern and pale.
Alan, this is very kind of you. Thank you for coming.
I decided never to enter your house again, Gray. But you said it was a matter of life and death.
His voice was hard and cold. He took a chair by the table, and Dorian sat opposite him. The 2 men were silent. Then Dorian spoke.
Alan, in a locked room at the top of this house, a dead man is sitting at a table. He's been dead for 10 hours now. Don't look at me like that. Who the man is, why and how he died isn't important to you. What you have to do is this.
Stop, Gray. I don't want to know anything more. Keep your horrible secrets to yourself. I don't want to be mixed up in your life. It doesn't interest me.
Alan, it will have to interest you. I'm very sorry, but you're the only man who can save me. You're a scientist. You know all about chemistry. You must destroy the body upstairs so that nothing remains of it.
You're mad, Dorian, to make this monstrous confession. I will have nothing to do with this matter. Do you think I'm going to ruin my reputation for you?
He committed suicide, Alan.
Who drove him to it? You, I suppose.
Do you still refuse to do this for me?
Of course I refuse. I don't care what shame comes on you. You deserve it all. You've come to the wrong man. Go to some of your friends. Don't come to me.
Alan, it was murder. I killed him. You don't know how he made me suffer, although he may not have intended it.
Murder? Good God, Dorian, is that what you have come to? I won't report you to the police. It's none of my business, but I'll have nothing to do with it.
Wait a moment. All I ask of you is to perform a scientific experiment. Think of the position I'm in. We were friends once, Alan.
Don't speak about those days, Dorian. They're dead. I absolutely refuse to do anything.
You refuse?
Yes.
I beg you.
It's useless.
A look of pity came into Dorian Gray's eyes. Then he took a piece of paper and wrote something on it. He read it twice, folded it and pushed it across the table. Then he got up and went over to the window. Campbell looked at him in surprise, took the paper and opened it. As he read it, his face became white and he fell back in his chair. A horrible sense of sickness came over him. After 2 or 3 minutes of terrible silence, Dorian came and stood behind him, putting his hand on his shoulder.
I'm so sorry for you, Alan,
he murmured.
But you leave me no alternative. I have a letter written already. Here it is. You see the address. If you don't help me, I'll send it. You know what the result will be. It's impossible for you to refuse now.
Campbell buried his face in his hands. He was trembling.
The thing has to be done. Face it and do it,
said Dorian.
I can't do it,
he said mechanically.
You have no choice.
Campbell hesitated for a moment.
Is there a fire in the room upstairs?
Yes, there's a gas fire.
I must go home and get some things from the laboratory.
No, Alan, you mustn't leave the house. Write on a piece of paper what you want and my servant will bring the things to you.
Campbell wrote a few things on a piece of paper. Dorian gave it to his servant with the order to return as soon as possible. As the clock struck 1, Campbell looked at Dorian Gray and said,
You're wicked. Absolutely wicked.
Alan, you've saved my life,
said Dorian.
What a life. You've gone from corruption to corruption.
At about 2 o'clock, the servant returned with a large box filled with the things Campbell had asked for.
You have the rest of the day to yourself, Francis.
Thank you, sir.
When the servant left, the 2 men carried the box up the stairs. Dorian unlocked the door and looked at Campbell.
I don't think I can go in, Alan.
He shuddered.
I don't need you,
said Campbell coldly. Dorian half opened the door and saw the face of the picture looking at him with its disgusting smile. The night before, for the first time in his life, he had forgotten to cover the fatal canvas. He rushed to cover it, and then saw something that made him shudder with horror. On one of the hands there was a large red spot, as if the canvas had sweated blood. It was horrible, more horrible than the silent thing sitting at the table. Dorian threw the cover on the portrait. Campbell brought in the heavy box.
Leave me alone now,
he said in a stern voice, and Dorian left the room. It was long after 7 when Campbell came back into the library. He was pale, but absolutely calm.
I've done what you asked me to do,
he muttered.
And now, goodbye. Let us never see each other again.
You've saved me from ruin, Alan. I can't forget that,
said Dorian simply. As soon as Campbell had left, he went upstairs. There was a horrible smell of nitric acid in the room, but the thing that had been sitting at the table was gone. Chapter 11. The Opium Den. That evening, exquisitely dressed, Dorian Gray entered Lady Narborough's dining room. No one looking at Dorian Gray could possibly have believed that he had murdered a man. It was a small party, and Dorian was glad to know that Lord Henry was going to be there too. His head ached, and at dinner he could not eat anything. He drank champagne eagerly, but his thirst seemed to increase.
Dorian,
said Lord Henry at last.
What's the matter with you tonight?
I'm tired, Harry, that's all. I think I'll go home now.
When he returned home, Dorian opened the secret cupboard where he had hidden Basil Hallward's coat and bag. He threw them into the big fire that was burning in the library. The smell of burning clothes and burning leather was horrible. In 3/4 of an hour the fire had destroyed everything. Dorian felt tired and sick, but suddenly his eyes became strangely bright, and his lips began to tremble. He needed to escape from reality for some time. He needed to forget what he had done. He got up from the sofa and went into his bedroom. When he came out at midnight, he was wearing old common clothes, and a large scarf covered his face. He went out of the house quietly. In Bond Street he found a carriage, and in a low voice gave the driver an address. The man shook his head. "It's too far for me." Dorian gave him a gold coin and said,
"You'll get another if you drive fast."
"All right, sir," answered the man. "You'll be there in an hour." And he drove rapidly. A cold rain began to fall, and the street lamps looked ghastly in the mist. The moon hung low in the sky like a yellow skull. Lying in the carriage, Dorian repeated to himself the words that Lord Henry had said to him on the first day they met.
To cure the soul by means of the senses, and the senses by means of the soul.
Yes, that was the secret. The hideous hunger for opium began to eat at him. His throat burnt. He had often tried it, and would try it again now. There were opium dens where one could forget. Dens of horror where the memory of old sins could be destroyed by the madness of new sins. After the long ride, he got out of the carriage and knocked on the door of a small, dirty house. He entered a long, low room. There were men lying on the filthy floor, and in a corner a sailor was sitting at a table with his head buried in his arms. At the end of the room there was a staircase leading upstairs. As Dorian climbed the steps, the heavy smell of opium came to meet him. He smiled with pleasure. When he entered, he noticed a young man with yellow hair smoking a long, thin pipe.
Adrian Singleton, are you here?
Murmured Dorian.
Where else could I be?
Answered the young man.
No one speaks to me anymore, but I don't care, because as long as one has this stuff, one doesn't want friends.
Dorian shuddered and looked at the grotesque things that lay on the old mattresses. He wanted to leave. Memory was eating his soul away. From time to time he seemed to see the eyes of Basil Hallward looking at him. He wanted to escape from himself. As he was leaving, a woman shouted,
There goes the devil's friend!
Curse you!
Answered Dorian.
Don't call me that!
Prince Charming is what you like to be called, isn't it?
She shouted. The sailor, who had been sitting in a corner, jumped to his feet as she spoke and looked wildly around. Dorian had just gone out, and the sailor hurried after him. Dorian Gray walked quickly along the road, but as he reached the corner, a brutal hand closed around his throat. Dorian fought wildly for his life. Then he saw a pistol pointing at his head.
What do you want?
He gasped.
Keep quiet, or I'll shoot you.
You're mad! What have I done to you?
You destroyed the life of Sybil Vane.
Answered the sailor.
And Sybil Vane was my sister. She killed herself because of you. For years I've looked for you, but I only knew the name she used to call you. Prince Charming. I heard your name by chance tonight. Pray to God, because tonight you're going to die.
Dorian Gray was sick with terror.
I never knew her. You're mad.
He stammered. Suddenly, a wild hope crossed his mind.
Stop!
He cried.
How long ago did your sister die?
18 years ago.
James Vane replied.
18 years?
Laughed Dorian Gray.
Take me to the light and look at my face.
James Vane hesitated, and then pushed him towards the light. And he saw the face of a boy of 20 with all the purity of youth. It was obvious that he was not the man who had destroyed her life.
My God,
cried James Vane.
I nearly murdered you. Forgive me, sir.
Go home and put that pistol away before you get into trouble,
said Dorian, turning around and walking away. James Vane stood on the road in horror. Then a woman's hand touched his arm.
Why didn't you kill him? He's evil!
She said.
He isn't the man I'm looking for. The man whose life I want must be nearly 40 now. This one is little more than a boy.
The woman gave a bitter laugh.
Little more than a boy? It's 18 years since Prince Charming made me what I am.
You're lying,
cried James Vane.
By God, I'm telling the truth. I met him 18 years ago. He hasn't changed since then.
With a cry, James Vane ran to the corner of the road, but Dorian had disappeared, and the woman had vanished as well. Chapter 12. The Metamorphosis. One spring evening, Dorian Gray and Lord Henry were dining together.
Don't tell me you're going to be good. You're perfect. Don't change,
cried Lord Henry.
No, Harry. I've done too many terrible things in my life. I'm not going to do them any more. I began my good actions yesterday in the country.
Anybody can be good in the country,
said Lord Henry, smiling.
There are no temptations there. But tell me about your good action.
Some time ago, I met a girl in a village. She was very beautiful, like Sybil Vane. Do you remember her? We fell in love, and during the wonderful month of May, I went to see her. She was ready to run away with me, but I said no. I didn't want to ruin her life. I left her as flower-like as I found her.
So you broke her heart, and this was your good action?
Said Lord Henry, laughing.
Harry!
Cried Dorian.
You're horrible. Of course, she cried, but her reputation is safe. Let's talk about other things. What's happening in London?
People are still discussing poor Basil's disappearance.
I thought they'd be tired of that by now,
said Dorian.
Not yet, although there are plenty of other things to talk about. There's my divorce case and Alan Campbell's suicide. But poor Basil still interests them. Scotland Yard insists that Basil left for Paris, but the French police declare that Basil never arrived there.
Don't people say that he was murdered?
Asked Dorian.
Some newspapers do, but it doesn't seem probable.
What would you say if I told you that I murdered Basil?
Asked Dorian. He watched Lord Henry carefully.
No, Dorian, you wouldn't murder anyone. All crime is vulgar, just as all vulgarity is crime. Ordinary people murder because it's their way of finding the extraordinary pleasure that art gives us. But enough of Basil. What happened to the portrait that Basil painted of you? Oh, yes, I remember. You said it had been stolen. What a pity.
I never really liked it.
Tell me the secret of your eternal youth, Dorian. You look like the day I first met you. I wish I could change places with you. Life has been your art.
Yes, life has been wonderful, but I'm not going to have the same life. You don't know everything about me. If you did, even you would turn from me. Don't laugh.
You and I will always be friends,
said Lord Henry.
Yet you poisoned me with a book once. Harry, promise me that you'll never lend that book to anyone. It does harm.
Lord Henry looked at the moonlit garden.
Let's go to the club.
I'm tired tonight. I want to go to bed early. I'll see you tomorrow.
One evening, when Dorian arrived home, he threw himself on the sofa and began to think. Was it really true that one could never change? He had filled his mind with corruption, committed horrible crimes, and had been an evil influence on others. Was there no hope for him? Why had he ever made that monstrous wish about the picture? He had kept his youth and beauty, but he had paid a terrible price. He picked up a mirror and looked at his face. It disgusted him, and he threw the mirror on the floor where it broke in 1,000 silver pieces. James Vane, Alan Campbell, Basil Hallward would soon fade away. It was the death of his own soul that tormented him. He wanted a new life. Then he remembered the country girl. He had not destroyed her innocence. He had done one good thing, and he wondered if the portrait had changed. Perhaps if his life became pure, he would be able to cancel every sign of corruption from the portrait. He took the lamp and went upstairs to look at it. He entered quietly and removed the cover. A cry of pain and anger came from him.
Ah!
He could see no change, except that in the eyes there was now a look of falsity, and on the mouth a smile of hypocrisy. The thing was more horrible than before. It was only out of vanity and hypocrisy that he had spared the young girl. But was the murder going to torment him all his life? Should he confess and be put to death? Never. The picture was the only evidence against him. He would destroy it. He looked around and saw the knife that had stabbed Basil Hallward. He would destroy the past. He seized the knife and stabbed the picture with it. There was a horrible, agonizing cry. And a crash. The servants woke and talked in low, frightened voices. They went up to the room and knocked, but there was no reply. They could not open the door, so they climbed down from the roof and entered through the window. When they entered, they found the splendid portrait of their master in all his exquisite youth and beauty. Lying on the floor was a dead man with a knife in his heart. He was hideously ugly and old. It was not until they examined his rings that they recognized who it was.